Cyberpunk 2077 releases next week. And although I'm sure for many of us at this point, we've basically had a December 10th release date stamped into our brains, for many, you'll actually be playing Cyberpunk 2077 even a bit before that, earlier than December 10th. In this video, I want to discuss the possibility of that for many of you. Even further, there was recently an earnings call from CD Projekt. In this, we heard all kinds of news, apparently how the DLC was delayed, as some headlines are claiming, multiplayer mode details, and quite a bit more. And then lastly, there's been about 8 minutes of additional footage released. This being based off the most recent trailer for the game, that trailer that has now surpassed 20 million views on YouTube. And although some of the footage is the same, some of it is new and different. So we'll go through that and break down some of the interesting finds we can discover within. So Cyberpunk 2077 isn't releasing on December 10th everywhere. You may have seen this post go up recently describing the Cyberpunk 2077 release date in all time zones, and despite how much attention and how much reposting this has gotten, the post itself doesn't actually have a source. But more or less, after doing a bit of digging myself, it seems like the source being commonly used around this is actually this countdown timer on GOG. GOG is owned by CD Projekt, of course the developers of Cyberpunk 2077, and the only way to get this to show up is to actually pre-order the game. And yeah, I actually just pre-ordered the game on GOG at extra time for this countdown. So hey, if you want to like the video for that one, I would appreciate it. But either way, what this means is the countdown timer should end at UTC 0. And then of course from there you can extrapolate where it's releasing in various time zones. For the Americas, since that is going to be most of my audience, it'll release at 7 p.m. Eastern time on December 9th. And of course you could extrapolate that to 4 p.m. Pacific time on December 9th. And this post does have a full and accurate breakdown. It looks like it's going off this GOG countdown. Although an important disclaimer with this, technically this hasn't been confirmed by CD Projekt. This is how it worked for The Witcher 3, and many modern games that have universal release times do function in this way, where it's kind of releasing a bit early in some territories than others. But right now it looks like it's mostly just based off this countdown timer, so of course that means it is subject to change. They may come out and update it. Another interesting observation with this, on Stadia it does end at the same time, giving more credence to this, but on PlayStation, according to some Reddit users, it actually ends at a different time. So if you pre-ordered Cyberpunk 2077 on your PlayStation, the countdown timer right now seems to end at midnight Eastern time, which would make the ending of that one about 5 hours after the ending of this one. So hopefully that one is just a bit inaccurate. The Witcher 3 released at the same time on PC, Xbox One, and PS4, so it would definitely be pretty surprising if this ends up being accurate. But either way, this is pretty exciting. Many of us will get our hands on this game a bit earlier than expected, but even further, you should be seeing and hearing a lot more about this game earlier than expected. CD Projekt just reported their Q3 earnings, and in this we got details on a variety of things, including review codes and the embargo for this. This call is from the middle of last week, and in it they mentioned that in the next 2 weeks we'll be sending review copies of the game to journalists around the world, enabling them to publish their impressions and reviews of Cyberpunk before its release. And later in the call do restate that the embargo for reviews will lift before the release of the game. So a couple of interesting things about this. Based off the wording, it does make it seem like that review copies have not yet been sent out. I've requested one and have yet to receive one, so at least for me and a couple of other YouTubers, it doesn't seem like they have their hands on it yet. I wouldn't be shocked if larger media outlets like IGN and GameSpot perhaps do have hands on, but based off this wording, it seems like as of Wednesday of last week, review copies weren't sent out, and they would be sent out at some point in the next 2 weeks, probably at some point this week. And I'm actually going to be really curious to see if that's even enough time to play this game comprehensively and in its entirety, especially for those who try and review it on multiple platforms. The embargo is lifting before the release date, so you may only have a week or even less to play through the entirety of Cyberpunk 2077 potentially for a review. It'll also be interesting to see if this is just reviews and first impressions, or if we'll start to see live streams of the game, people just posting raw gameplay before release. Either way, again, if you're trying to avoid spoilers, now is definitely the time to filter out words on Twitter and start avoiding certain social media platforms. One of the other interesting announcements they made is that the crucial and most intensive period of marketing for Cyberpunk 2077 will begin on December 1st. So if you're watching this as it goes live, we could see some new gameplay or trailers coming out tomorrow. One of the interesting things they were planning to do with Cyberpunk 2077 was actually announce the DLC and expansions before the release date. In this earnings call, we find out that this has actually been delayed. Season Pass and expansion news will now come after the release date. They don't give a concrete timeline as to when we'll hear more, but we do know that we should be getting a lot more details in Q1 of 2021. As they expand here that following the release of the game, they internally plan to update their strategy strategy going forward. So in Q1 2021, seemingly during another earnings call like this one, or they mentioned maybe having a standalone event for investors, they'll be talking about somewhat of a timeline for other and future projects and perhaps even reveal some details on those projects. So things like Cyberpunk 2077 multiplayer, seems like we could hear somewhat about the next game after Cyberpunk. So I wouldn't be shocked if over the next few months we actually get a more concrete timeline as to what's next. As right now, even though we've known about Cyberpunk for a long time, we're kind of at an ending point and we're entering into a new chapter. And as far as some of their remarks on the multiplayer mode, they mentioned that no concrete release date has been announced. 2022 is not the release date of this necessarily. And even further, they're not really even calling it a multiplayer mode. They are very much so viewing it as a new product, a dedicated production and a big production. But they don't share any further details around monetization just yet. Again, that may come in 2021 with these further deep dives on future projects. As far as some of the other quotes that came out from this, it was mentioned how Keanu Reeves has played the game. He may have not finished it yet, but he does love it. They mentioned how they don't really foresee a negative impact from the recent leak around Cyberpunk 2077. Some gameplay of the Nomad start was recently posted online, but they mentioned here that it was pretty early on and there weren't many spoilers. There's a question on some of the bugginess reported in hands-on previews. I recently made a comprehensive video looking at all of those previews summed up, and we discovered that several bugs from the previews have already been fixed in the game, which isn't surprising, but even further they expand that once we see review copies go out, those will have even less bugs, and then the live version of the game should have even less bugs than the review copies. There's some questions around the game not currently being shown on last-gen consoles and the base versions, so the PS4 and the Xbox One. They mentioned how performance is a bit lower than on pros, but surprisingly good on them. Now, I'm not sure if they would say something very different, but I still for one think it is pretty suspicious or at least somewhat concerning that we haven't seen anything on a PS4 or an Xbox One. Not to say things will run horribly on it, but it would definitely be pretty reassuring to see some gameplay or even some combat where we may get frame drops on those consoles before it's actually in people's hands. Although on the topic of the delay, they mentioned that they feel like the time gained by postponing the release has been used to further optimize the game, and it's been described in the past how last-gen versions were really the cause of the delay, and they overall feel like the delay was the right decision. So that is without a doubt somewhat reassuring. But then moving on to some of that new gameplay and some of the new trailer clips. For one reason or another, in the recent release of the Japanese version of the Cyberpunk 2077 trailer, we actually saw a bit more than the English release of the trailer. This in a couple of ways. One, there are some totally new scenes in that version of the trailer. Never before seen footage, one of the most notable being the scuba diving scene that looks awesome. But even further, several clips were just extended, a much longer version shared during this other iteration of the trailer that either gives way more context to the scene or really just gives you a better look at what's happening in the scene overall. And I gotta say, after watching the trailer, watching some of the extended clips, it just looks way better. So to end off this video, I compiled some of the clips from the new trailer so you could check out some of the new gameplay or the extended versions of these clips for yourself. With that said, if you enjoyed the video, you can leave a like or subscribe. But otherwise, here's some of that beautiful Cyberpunk 2077 gameplay.
Black Mick Jagger, abracadabra, black Cadillac, turn a nigga to cadaver. I'm over flexing, still protective. Come straight for your neck, bitch, natural selection. Roll another blunt, smoke it to perfection. We don't give a fuck, you don't give a fuck. Check this. Suicide is a sewer. What? Yeah, you know what it is, nigga. Suicide is a sewer. What? Chipping in, fucking feeling out the net. Can't be killed cause I'm ready dead. Stand 2 feet that goes within. It's chipping in, it's chipping in.